So this week I'm giving you 10 different tips to watch out for, and next week I'm sharing with you my own personal homebrew random encounter system with lots of different tweaks and changes that you can make to best fit your table, because random encounters are when exploration meets combat in some sort of hostile encounter, or social encounters in some sort of person-to-person interaction, which is what my entire Kickstarter book is all about. Alcantar's Almanac of All Things is an expansion to the 5th edition rule set of all 3 pillars: combat, social encounters, exploration, of all these different ways. And in that book is going to be multiple different ways of how you can handle encounters, encounter tables, how to set them up and build them for yourself. Not only am I giving you systems you can straight up use at your table, I'm also trying to inspire that creativity in you to take these systems, see what you can maybe tweak and change to best fit you and your table. If you want to see a sneak peek at any of this stuff, I have an entire combat system of weapons, armor, and martial action. Or next week's video, I'm going to be sharing my random encounter table. I'll also link that in the description once that video goes out. And if you want to see the Kickstarter itself, links down in the description. So here we go. So these 10 mistakes are mistakes in my opinion. And maybe if you take a step back and look at it, maybe you might rethink the way that you're using them, and you might not even realize that you're doing some of these things. So number 1 is to use random tables purely randomly. But wait, coach, that's the point. They're supposed to be random, right? These first 2 tips talk about the control of the Dungeon Master, because what shows up, like the things that are in the random encounter, shouldn't be purely random and have nothing to do with anything. You should be able to, as a Dungeon Master, know, I want to have these certain things I want to throw at my players. Now, if I'm ever in that spot where I don't know if I want to throw this at them or not, and I'm on the fence about it, make it a random encounter. Make it come down to a roll and see if the random encounter happens. And if it does happen, the encounter that happens would not be random, it's the one that you want. Which brings me to tip number 2, is when these random encounters happen, shouldn't just be random. You as a Dungeon Master should be able to control when they happen or not, and when you ask for those rolls. So don't pigeonhole yourself into a corner where you have some system where you tell them every time that this happens, we'll roll for a random encounter. So now it's out there and it's out of your hands now. You've lost control of when the random encounters happen, because every time this happens, oh, we did this, or we had a long rest, or we had it every time. It shouldn't be every time. It should be on you as the Dungeon Master for when that moment feels right to ask for a roll for a random encounter. And depending on how you do it as a Dungeon Master, maybe you make rolls for it behind your screen, or maybe they make rolls for it. You should be in control when those happen. Basically, these first 2 points, random encounters shouldn't happen randomly with random things. There should be a little bit more that goes into it. And you don't want to lose control as a Dungeon Master of when they happen, and you should be able to ask for them and not put yourself in a corner of like, oh, this situation, we have to do a random encounter. Oh, now there's a random encounter, and it becomes a little bit of slog that even you yourself as a Dungeon Master didn't want to have happen. But we'll get into when you can roll for these random encounters here in just a little bit. Tip number 3 is hit all 3 pillars of the game. Random encounters, technically I guess would be under the exploration thing, because you're exploring and things happen, but they should be in all 3 pillars. You should be able to randomly have an encounter where you have combat happen. Some sort of creature attacks you, some sort of things happening. Yes, of course, those are classic, but you should also have random encounters that are exploration. Maybe you stumble upon some ruins and there's no combat in the ruins. They're just ruins that you get to go explore. Maybe you stumble across some secret treasure or a body that's laying there. That's not a combat. There's no social encounter. That's just a body, but there's something on there. There's a note on there, some sort of exploration pieces and nuggets that they can find. And the 3rd pillar is social. Maybe they encounter somebody or a group of people on the road. And now that could be a combat, or is it social? I don't know. Or maybe it's a social exploration and it's somebody that wants you to go investigate something with them. There's a combination of all 3 of these pillars you can mix and match to give a bunch of different options so they never know what they're going to come across. Because if random encounters are only combat, everyone's going to always dread random encounters, and they aren't going to have this whimsical like excitement of what could possibly be. If they have a random encounter happen, it shouldn't be like, oh no, it shouldn't always be a negative thing. Which brings me to number 4, is always having random encounters being some sort of negative outcome, like it's some sort of fight that happens or some sort of boulder avalanche. It's always a negative thing. You want to, and this was a mistake I made. This one's on me. All of my random encounters were these very bad things that were going to happen. And they never found a stagecoach of a traveling salesman, an old gypsy woman that would read their fortunes, other things that tied into maybe their backstories, little nuggets towards other clues between the 2 towns they were in. There are lots of stuff you're able to do here besides just throwing combat at them, and again, making them excited to possibly maybe get something cool. And this also breaks away from, if you have a random encounter happen, they're not going to stereotypically think, oh, this is a combat, and they see some hooded figure approaching and they just attack them out of nowhere. They're going to be a little bit more inquisitive and on their toes. Number 5 mistake for random encounters is when they don't make sense in the current situation. Because if you use random encounters randomly, and what they find is random, like tip number 1, and they just randomly find wolves in the middle of the desert. Wait, what? Like they should be able to make sense for the location. So be ready when you have these random encounter tables to be able to tweak what they're actually encountering, because again, you don't want random encounters to feel random. There's lots of different things I've been going over here of what makes it feel random and just out of place, like, oh, okay, then the world doesn't feel right and it contradicts itself and it's just weird. So brings me to tip number 6, customize those random encounters to fit the situation. There's 2 different ways I handle this as a dungeon master, whether it's in game prep for the specific session or game prep of just general tools that I can use anytime in any campaign or any one shot or anything I run, is have generalized, very vague random encounter tables where they encounter a blank that is currently eating the carcass of something. So some big creature is eating the carcass of another creature. And as a dungeon master, I can insert those 2 things there that would make sense for if they're in a desert or if they're in a forest or if they're in the mountains. This is maybe the biggest tip here. Being vague as a dungeon master with these encounter tables lets you fill in the gaps perfectly to fit the situation they're in. The second thing you can do here, instead of making general tables, is to make very specific tables for very specific sections of your campaign. So if my players are in town A and I know they're going to go to town B at some point, between that time, I can have an encounter table for that section of travel. So for myself personally, all my encounter tables are D12 encounter tables. And again, you can see in the video that'll be down there in next week's or whatever, as to why that is. But if I'm filling out that encounter table and I have something, specifically between here and here, they know from town that there's this creature. Okay, if it roll a 1, I'm going to have that be a 1. And they're really looking for this person between here and there. I'm going to have that be the 12. And I'll start to fill out this encounter table. I love encounter tables. This is a bonus tip out of nowhere. 1s and 12s. I like to have the ends of the tables be bad and good. I like that. It fits to the theme of Dungeons and Dragons, I feel. But I start filling in the table, and I most likely for that specific section won't fill out a complete table of a full D12. So I'll have, let's just say I have 6 of them sprinkled down around the D12. I will take the other encounter tables I have, the generalized ones, and then fill in the gaps, and then boom, I have a specific table very easily for that section between town A and town B. Or you can flip that entire process around and take an encounter table that you like and start taking out the pieces of it that you don't like and insert the specific pieces that you do. And number 7, maybe I was wrong about the last one. This is the one that I hate. Random encounters like this. Again, my personal preference, but anytime someone gives me a random encounter table, I'm trying to look for random encounter tables to use. And specifically having to do with combat for this one, I'm talking about kind of combat type encounters. I hate random encounter tables with combat that just says 2 of this enemy. And that's all it gives you. It just gives you how many of an enemy. That is so boring. 3 orcs and a shaman. Okay. Cool. They just come out of nowhere. And yes, I know as a dungeon master, you can improv some sort of situation of something interesting that they're doing or whatever, but I can come up with random monsters that would fit the setting better than I could come up with some cool scenario that they're actually doing. Much less, why not have the best type of encounter tables, the ones that I try and make in any sort of supplement that I give to my patrons on Patreon or any sort of PDF that I've ever made. All of my encounter tables have some sort of interesting creature that has they're doing something interesting. The example I gave a second ago was a large creature's eating some sort of carcass. That's much cooler than just one large creature, and then it just comes out of the ground, or just you encounter it like in Pokemon or something. You're going to set yourself up a lot better as a dungeon master to be able to improv if you give some sort of 2 creatures are fighting over something. Those types of encounters that have an actual thing happening on top of whatever the monster is, that gives you freedom as a dungeon master to change either one of those. Change the monsters to be something else, or just have those monsters, and if there's a certain scenario that fits better, change it to that. Number 8 is when random encounters feel like a complete waste of time to the players. As a dungeon master, you might have these other things going on in your head. I want to wear them down a little bit. That's another thing you can use random encounters for. Wearing their resources down so they're a little bit weaker. So when they reach this spot, they don't have all the tools at their disposal, right? That's something we as dungeon masters can do. But to the players, what's the point of that? They're just worse off than they were. They don't feel necessarily like anything was gained from that. Now you could tell them things like, you get experience for stuff, but I also make sure that my players know you get experience for social and exploration and combat all the same, so don't worry about that. But anyway, maybe they find something from these random encounters. They get a pelt of the wolf that lets them be able to have some sort of materials that they could harvest. Maybe they find some items or something from the bandits and get at least a little something, or they were protecting a secret treasure hoard, or have a secret note that dropped that ties into something from the town they just left. Or the wolves, they're able to harvest the pelt in some way and scavenge some sort of material. Now, I'm not saying you have to always do this. Don't baby your players and always make sure that they get something every time, because you did always get something that's not what I'm saying, but have random encounters sometimes have something cool that they find, so that like, oh man, remember that one time we stumbled upon this cave that had this chest in the back? Oh my gosh, like this tomb that whatever it is, have them be exciting to where sometimes they get some really cool stuff. Because let me make sure this is really clear. I'm about to say number 9 and this connects to it. Sometimes random encounters should slow things down as far as logistically in the game. Maybe they were trying to get to some spot and the random encounter happens and it really causes some sort of problem, or the random encounter was they lost their way and they had to take a different route. It takes a lot longer, so now they lose time in some way. So number 9, random encounters, you should have the players have some sort of agency to be able to avoid it or not. Yes, some random encounters, throw them at your players. Yeah, there's nothing they could have done, whether it has to do with the story or it just really had to, like, you want to ambush them in some way. But even with that, you want to give them some way where it's going to feel bad if they just, nothing we could have done. We're going to get ambushed no matter what. Everyone has a surprise attacks. Okay, wow, thanks DM. Like, it's not going to feel as good, right? So give your players some sort of agency in being able to make some sort of rolls or prepare the campsite better, or they're looking around as they travel, constantly looking out for danger. That gets a little bit into travel and different ways you can run travel, which I have a whole video for that. I'll put that in the description as well. And rest systems for the night watches at rest. I'll put that in the description too. But you should give your players some sort of agency to be able to roll for something, or whenever the encounter happens and they see two creatures fighting. It doesn't have to always end in a combat. I think a lot of times rewarding players with creative thinking or creative social interactions to avoid what was going to be a combat feels really good. This is huge. I'm going on a rant on this, is reward your players for creatively thinking of social workarounds around combat instead of just walking up and attacking things. So many times Dungeon Masters are like, all my players do is just attack stuff. You probably have maybe reinforced that a little bit by not rewarding them for the times when they come up with something really creative and letting it happen. Let that combat go. I know you might have the battle mat ready. I know you might have miniatures ready, but sometimes you just got to bite that bullet. It's happened to me too, where there's no combat and they came up with something really smart and then they avoid that combat. In general, this empowers them of what happens to them is a direct cause of their actions on the world around them and how much they respect the world. If they're traveling through a dangerous place recklessly, yeah, throw some stuff at them. They're respecting the world around them and how they're navigating through it, and their descriptions of carefully moving through this dangerous area. Maybe go a little bit easier on them, and whenever they have encounters, they have a chance to avoid them. Give them rolls to maybe avoid some sort of detection from a creature or an interaction of some kind. Number 10 is when these random encounters actually happen. Like I said earlier, they shouldn't be random, but when, as a Dungeon Master, can you choose to ask for them? I think that's another time where Dungeon Masters don't really know when to ask for them, or when they ask for them is random and then they forget to sometimes or whatever. So here's a list of things that you can choose to. Again, I would not say as a Dungeon Master, every time these things happen, they get rolled for, because now it's out of your control. You've lost control of it, because you always want to keep control of when they happen. So here's just a list of ideas, the inspiration of different things that could trigger it for you behind the scenes. So you can make a check for an encounter at each section of the journey. And I'm very vague whenever I say that on purpose of what a section means. Maybe it's going from town A to town B, and you make one encounter check between point A and B. That's it. Maybe to get from town B to C, there's some sort of sanctuary side location where they have to go to because it's a really dangerous area and they can only rest in some sort of sanctuary type place. And they go and they stop here and then they go there, and you can make 2 different checks. So whatever the sections are, and little checkpoints, if you want to call them that, have an encounter at each checkpoint. But I've seen systems that use this type of thing too much, and the section becomes every hour and you're making encounter checks every hour. That kind of gets real grindy, and I usually stay away from that. Other more obvious instances are like Night's Watch. Whenever you take long rests in dangerous areas and you have to keep, a night watch halfway through, this group watches, and halfway through this group watches, maybe each of them makes a check of some kind, whether it's a perception check that's maybe used as an encounter check, or you have something you're rolling behind the scenes. However you choose to roll for these things, a Night's Watch is a really good time if they're out and traveling, or if they try and take a long rest in a dungeon, usually something frowned upon by Dungeon Masters, but that's a dangerous place. placed. It would make sense for there to be a random encounter to happen to kind of throw things off. That's a whole nother video topic I could do because I know that's a big issue. But I talk about that in my rest video as well. And I think my rest system kind of solves that problem. But Nat 1 survival checks when they're trying to navigate through something, or if somebody gets a Nat 1 in some sort of travel situation, maybe you roll a dice behind your screen or have some sort of random encounter happen. Another one I really like to do, this one's my favorite, is if players are talking and they're in a dangerous situation and they're talking about what to do next, or they're indecisive, or they're planning for too long about what's about to happen. I just roll a dice behind the screen, or ask them to make an encounter check using the system that I use. Just ask them for an encounter check or roll dice behind the screen. That always gets them all fired up. That type of thing, if they're being indecisive or slow moving, I'll kind of spur them along with some encounter check rolling. So there you go. I hope those 10 tips helped you out. Next week's video, I'm diving all the way into my system, which I feel so comfortable with, and I use that system across the board. All 10 of those tips I feel like are solved with the system that I use. Again, this is me personally, but the thing I like about it so much is all of those little rules that I have for my random encounter system. All of them have little tweaks and knobs and levers on them that you can tweak and change to best fit your table and how you use it for yourself, which is why I made Alcantar's Almanac. Smooth segue there. Because this book is not the rules the way I think they should be. They're the rules in a modifiable way for you to be able to take and choose for all parts of your game, whatever you're feeling. If it's random encounter tables, here you go. I got you covered. If it's something else having to do with combat or social, whatever it is, I hopefully got you covered. I'm going to try my best there. I appreciate it so much. Stay creative and think outside the box. Peace.